Welcome to the Deep Dive. We love to take these complex topics and try to unpack them and make them accessible, and today is no exception. Today we're tackling two biggies in applied behavior analysis, timeout and response cost.
Yeah, these are definitely concepts that sometimes spark a bit of debate. I think we need to get into those nuances.
Absolutely, and I think it's going to be really valuable to explore not just like the technical side of things, the definitions, but also how these techniques actually play out in real life.
Yeah, looking at some scenarios, figuring out when they work best and when they might, backfire a little.
Because every situation is different.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics.
Yeah, let's.
So punishment. I think that's a word that a lot of people hear. They immediately kind of, cringe. But in ABA, it's not about inflicting pain or anything like that.
Exactly. Yeah, it has a very specific meaning, right?
Yeah.
In ABA, punishment is about decreasing the likelihood of a behavior happening again.
So it's not about retribution. It's about changing behavior.
Absolutely. And I think it's also crucial to emphasize that we're talking about punishment as a last resort.
What do you mean by that?
So in ABA, we have a hierarchy of interventions. We always start with the least restrictive methods, like positive reinforcement, trying to teach and encourage desired behaviors.
Right.
And only when those methods have been exhausted do we consider punishment as a possibility. It's kind of like the emergency brake in your car. You don't use it for routine stops. You use it only when you absolutely have to.
I like that analogy. Okay, so punishment is like that last resort. It's about decreasing a behavior when other methods haven't worked. Now, let's dive into the specifics of these two techniques, starting with timeout. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about timeout is that it's just about isolating someone as punishment, like sending a kid to their room to think about what they did.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that image in their minds, but that's not really what timeout is about in ABA.
Okay, so what is it about then?
It's about giving the individual a break from the situation, interrupting that behavior chain. And importantly, it's about temporarily removing access to reinforcement.
So it's more about taking a pause, kind of hitting the reset button on the situation.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And there are actually different ways to implement timeout depending on the situation and the individual.
Like what?
Well, there's what we call non-exclusionary timeout. This is where the individual remains present but is removed from reinforcing activities. Let's say you have a kindergartner named Cheryl, and Cheryl loves art time, but she's throwing clay.
Oh, I can see that happening.
So in this case, a non-exclusionary timeout might involve having Cheryl sit away from the art table for a few minutes.
Okay, so she's still in the classroom, still part of the group, but she can't engage in the activity she enjoys.
Right. She's separated from the reinforcement, and then there's exclusionary timeout.
That's the one where someone is physically removed from the environment.
Right. Exactly. So let's say you have a 5-year-old. Let's call him Kenny. Kenny's known to talk back to his parents. An exclusionary timeout might involve sending Kenny to his room for a short period with no access to toys or TV or anything fun.
So the idea is that the time and environment, the place where the behavior is happening, needs to be reinforcing, needs to be somewhere they want to be for timeout to be effective.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. If the environment isn't rewarding, then removing someone from it isn't much of a consequence. And that's where the story of Kenny, that we talked about earlier, really highlights this.
How so?
Well, Kenny's parents didn't just use timeout in isolation. They used it alongside other techniques like clear instructions, a consistent response to his refusal, and lots of positive reinforcement for compliance. They were working on making that time-in environment, being with them and engaged in fun activities, much more desirable.
So timeout is more effective when it's part of a bigger picture.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to stress that timeout should be brief and focused on interrupting the behavior, not causing distress. We don't want to think of it as punishment in that traditional sense.
Right. We're not trying to make anyone feel bad.
Exactly. The goal is really just to disrupt that connection between the behavior and the reinforcer, make it clear that the behavior isn't going to lead to the desired outcome.
Okay, so you're breaking that chain. And you also mentioned before about preventing escape. How is that important?
That's about consistency, right? If the individual can avoid timeout, or if it's implemented inconsistently, then it loses its effectiveness. They learn that they can get away with the behavior.
So no giving in.
Exactly.
Oh.
And no interacting with the individual during timeout either.
Even to lecture them or reason with them?
Even then, because any interaction, even negative attention, can actually reinforce the behavior. We want to avoid that.
So it's like a clean break. You're removing them from the situation, no interaction, just that brief pause.
Oh,
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these little nuances really matter.
they do. And it's also important to remember that timeout, like any intervention, has its limitations.
Okay, give me an example of when it might not be the best approach.
Well, let's say you have a child who's engaging in behaviors to escape a task. Like maybe they really struggle with math and their outbursts are a way to get out of doing their homework.
Okay, I've seen that before.
In that case, sending them to timeout might actually backfire because now you're giving them exactly what they want, a break from that undesirable task.
Right, so understanding the function of the behavior, why they're doing it in the first place, is really important. Okay, so timeout's not always the answer. Now, what about response cost? This is the other punishment technique we're unpacking today.
Right. So response cost basically involves removing a specific amount of a reinforcer following an undesirable behavior. You can think of it like paying a fine.
So like a parking ticket. You park at a handicapped spot, you get a ticket. That ticket is the response cost.
Perfect example. And hopefully that hefty fine makes you think twice before parking there again. But parking tickets aren't the only example, right?
No, I remember we also had that story about those two brothers, Nico and Akito, who would always get into fights.
Yeah, and their parents implemented a system where every time they fought, a portion of their allowance was removed. So they were losing something they valued as a direct consequence of their fighting.
So it's about making them pay a price for that behavior, literally. But I also remember that it wasn't just about taking away money.
Right, that's a crucial point. Alongside the response cost, their parents also focused on teaching the boys problem-solving skills, how to compromise, how to communicate effectively, and importantly, they made sure to praise and reward them when they got along well.
So it seems like a key takeaway here is that response cost, like timeout, should be paired with positive reinforcement strategies.
Absolutely. We want to teach those alternative, desirable behaviors at the same time that we're decreasing the undesirable ones. It's not just about taking something away, it's about building up those positive skills.
And response cost. It's not just limited to like individual situations or family dynamics, right?
Right. It can be applied in broader contexts too. There was that fascinating study in Cincinnati back in the 70s. Before that, directory assistance calls were completely free.
Like calling 411.
Exactly, and they were getting flooded with calls. So they decided to implement a 20-cent charge for each call.
Wow, just 20 cents.
And guess what? The number of calls plummeted. This really shows how even a small cost can have a significant impact on behavior, even on a larger scale.
It's amazing how powerful those little incentives can be.
Yeah.
So we've got timeout, we've got response cost, both using that idea of punishment in a strategic way. But I imagine just like timeout, there are times when response cost might not be the best approach.
Of course, it's not a magic bullet, right? Just like with timeout, we need to think about the severity of the behavior, the individual's understanding of the consequence, and of course, ethical considerations.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to, take away someone's meal as a consequence.
Exactly. You have to make sure the consequence is proportional, that it's ethical, and that it's actually going to be effective. You wouldn't want to remove something essential for well-being.
So it's all about that careful consideration, that individualization. Okay, so we've defined punishment in the context of ABA. We've unpacked timeout, we've unpacked response cost, we've talked about understanding the function of behavior, ethical considerations, all these important factors. But how do we know which technique to use, when to use it, and how to implement it effectively?
How do we know when to use which technique?
Yeah, how do we make those decisions? Because it's clear that these aren't one-size-fits-all solutions, right?
Definitely not. And one of the biggest, I'd say the most crucial factor, is understanding the function of the behavior. Like we touched on earlier with that example of a child struggling with math, remember?
Yeah, where their outbursts were a way to escape that task.
Exactly. So if the function of the behavior is escape, then timeout, which is supposed to be removing something desirable, could actually backfire.
Because it gives them exactly what they want, a break from the work. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So it's not just about the behavior itself, but why they're doing it.
Right. We have to figure out what's driving the behavior. Is it attention-seeking? Is it escape-motivated? Is it sensory? There are lots of possibilities, and that's where a functional assessment comes in. We need to do that before we even consider timeout or response cost.
So function first, got it. What else do we need to think about?
Well, the individual's developmental level and cognitive abilities are also key factors. Like, can they actually understand the connection between their behavior and the consequence? For a toddler, Removing a portion of their allowance might not be very meaningful, but a brief separation from a favorite toy could be much more effective.
It's kind of like with those parking tickets. They only work if the person understands that illegal parking will cost them money. If they don't get that connection, then it's not going to change their behavior.
Exactly. And, speaking of parking tickets, they bring up another important point. Sometimes timeout or response cost, even if they make sense in theory, might not be feasible or appropriate for the situation. Like practicality and social acceptability are factors too.
I can see that. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine trying to implement timeout in a crowded grocery store when a child is having a meltdown. Logistically, how do you do that? Yeah. Or think about response costs with a teenager who doesn't have an allowance or any privileges you can control. It's just not going to work.
Yeah. So it's not just about whether the technique itself is effective. It's about whether you can actually apply it in that specific situation. And of course, we always have to consider the ethical implications.
Absolutely. Like, removing a reinforcer, it should never cause harm or violate an individual's basic rights. That's a non-negotiable.
Right, like you wouldn't want to take away someone's meal or deny them access to, basic necessities. That would be crossing a line.
Sure. And even when we're talking about reinforcers that are appropriate to remove, we still need to be mindful of potential unintended consequences. Like, for example, if we use response costs too frequently or the consequences too harsh, like way out of proportion to the behavior, it can actually impact motivation and create a sense of unfairness.
Right. It's like finding that balance.
Exactly. It's like we want the consequence to be meaningful enough to change the behavior, but we don't want it to be overly punitive or feel unjust.
Okay, so function, development, practicality, ethics, all these things are swirling around in our heads. So how can we make sure that timeout and response cost are used effectively and ethically? Like, what are the steps?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, we need clear, well-defined rules. Everybody involved needs to understand exactly what behaviors will lead to what consequences. No ambiguity. And this is where consistency comes in again. Right?
Consistency seems to be a recurring theme here.
And for good reason.
Yeah.
If the consequence is applied inconsistently, like sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, well, it leads to confusion and weakens the whole intervention. The individual doesn't know what to expect, and it just becomes a mess.
Got it. Clear rules, consistency, what else?
Teaching replacement behaviors is crucial, too. Punishment should always be part of a bigger intervention plan. We want to teach appropriate alternative behaviors and reinforce those positive choices.
So it's not just about stopping bad behavior. It's about giving them the tools to replace it with good behavior.
Precisely. It's about building a foundation for long-term success. And of course, throughout this whole process, data collection is vital.
Always got to have that data.
Absolutely. We need to track how effective these techniques are and be ready to adjust our approach if things aren't working as intended. The data guides our decisions and helps us make sure we're providing the best and most ethical support.
Makes sense.
Wrong.
Okay, so we've got, understanding the function of the behavior, considering the individual's needs, the context of the situation, consistency, incorporating positive reinforcement. Lots to think about. But what about those challenges we might face when actually putting all of this into practice? Like in the real world, things aren't always so neat and tidy.
You're absolutely right. It's not always smooth sailing, even when we've carefully considered all these factors. Like, remember Kenny, the little boy who was talking back to his parents?
Yeah.
He initially argued and complained a lot when his parents first tried to implement timeout. And that's understandable, right? Change can be difficult, especially when it involves losing something you enjoy.
It's like taking away a privilege or a favorite activity. It's bound to cause some resistance.
Right, and that's why it's so important to prepare individuals for these interventions. We need to explain the rationale behind it in a way that they can understand, emphasizing that it's not about punishment in that traditional sense, but about helping them learn and make better choices.
So it's about communication, building trust.
Exactly. And what about pushback from caregivers? I imagine some parents might be really hesitant to use techniques that they perceive as punitive.
I can definitely see that happening, especially with all the baggage that the word punishment carries.
Yeah, and we often encounter those misconceptions, both within and outside the field of ABA. People might associate punishment with, harsh or abusive practices, which is understandable given how punishment has sometimes been used, unfortunately.
It goes back to that idea that punishment has become kind of a bad word.
Exactly. So it's really our responsibility to educate caregivers about the ethical and evidence-based use of these techniques, to help them understand that punishment in ABA is about strategically decreasing behavior, It's not about inflicting pain or making the individual suffer.
Right. It's not about being mean. It's about being effective and helping their child or whoever we're working with thrive.
Precisely. And when we can explain that rationale, provide clear guidelines, and address concerns with empathy and understanding, we can often gain their cooperation. It's about collaboration, about working towards shared goals.
It sounds like building trust and rapport is key.
Absolutely. And it doesn't just stop there. We need to provide ongoing support and guidance to make sure these techniques are being used appropriately and effectively. We're partners in this process.
Okay, so it's clear that implementing timeout and response cost effectively. It requires a lot of planning, careful execution, and open communication with everyone involved.
It definitely does. These are powerful techniques, and we have to use them responsibly. Like with great power comes great responsibility, right?
I like that.
We have an obligation to use these tools ethically and with a deep understanding of the principles of behavior change.
And that's what I find so interesting about ABA.
Sure.
It's not just about following a set of rules. It's about using our knowledge and skills to create these individualized interventions that really make a difference in people's lives. But before we get too philosophical here, I think it would be helpful to look at some specific examples of how timeout and response cost have been used successfully in real-world settings. What do you think?
I think that's a great idea. Let's see how these techniques play out in practice.
Right, because talking about theory is one thing, but seeing these techniques in action is a whole other level.
Exactly. So I thought we could start by looking at a classic study by Matthews and colleagues. They were focused on decreasing dangerous behaviors in toddlers.
Dangerous behaviors. With toddlers. That sounds pretty intense.
It can be, yeah. Think about things like, toddlers touching electrical cords or hot appliances or putting small objects in their mouths.
Oh, yeah, all that stuff that makes you, as a parent, just like constantly on edge.
Exactly. So the researchers were working with mothers and their one-year-old children who were engaging in these risky behaviors.
Okay, so how do they go about addressing that?
Well, first and foremost, they really emphasize prevention. The mothers were instructed to childproof their homes as much as possible to make those dangerous things inaccessible.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you can't exactly baby-proof the entire world, can you?
You're absolutely right. And that's where the timeout component came in. Alongside childproofing, they taught the mothers to use exclusionary timeout whenever their child engaged in one of those dangerous behaviors.
Okay, so like what? Would they yell at the kid?
No yelling. They were instructed to stay calm, just say no, remove the child from the area, and place them in a playpen for a brief period.
Ah, so the playpen was the timeout location.
Exactly. And the results were really encouraging. They found that the dangerous behaviors decreased significantly for all the children who participated in the study.
That's awesome. So even with really young kids, timeout can be effective.
Yeah, when it's implemented correctly, of course. Now, another study I wanted to mention is by Rortvet and Miltenberger. They looked at using exclusionary timeout to address non-compliance in 4-year-old girls.
Non-compliance. Oh, man. That's a challenge that I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to.
Definitely. It's a common one. So in this study, the girls were refusing to follow their parents' requests, like, simple things like cleaning up their toys or getting dressed. And what was happening was that the parents were actually inadvertently reinforcing this behavior by, giving in or getting caught up in arguments.
Yeah, it's like that classic power struggle.
Exactly. So the researchers worked with the parents to implement timeout whenever their daughter refused to comply with a request.
So, how did that work? Was it a specific time limit?
Yeah. So if the child didn't follow the request within 20 seconds, they were calmly taken to another room and asked to sit in a chair for 1 minute.
Okay, so short and sweet, consistent.
Precisely. They also explained to the child why she was in timeout, but avoided any further interaction or discussion during that time.
So again, that consistency is key.
Absolutely. And you want to know the results.
Yeah, tell me.
The girls' non-compliant behaviors decreased significantly. The parents were really surprised by how quickly this technique, this seemingly simple technique, actually made a difference.
It's amazing how sometimes the simplest things can be the most effective. It all comes back to those core principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Understanding the function, applying the technique consistently, all of that.
Absolutely. And now let's switch gears and talk about some real-world applications of response cost. I've got a really interesting one for you.
Okay, lay it on me.
All right, so this study by Marholin and Gray, they were investigating the effect of response cost on cash shortages in a restaurant.
Cash shortages in a restaurant. Now, that's something I haven't heard before.
Yeah. So this restaurant was experiencing pretty significant cash shortages, like they were averaging about 4% of their daily income lost.
Wow, that's a huge hit to their bottom line.
Yeah, definitely not sustainable. So to address this problem, they decided to implement a group response cost procedure.
Okay, group response cost, what does that look like?
So at the end of each day, if the cash shortage exceeded 1%, that amount was divided among all the cashiers and deducted from their paychecks.
Ah, so they tied a very direct consequence to the accuracy of their work.
Exactly. And guess what? The daily cash shortages decreased significantly, and they consistently stayed below that 1% mark from that point on.
That's incredible. So response cost, it can be a real motivator even in a workplace setting.
Yeah, and it really highlights that principle of using a reinforcer that's meaningful to the individuals involved. In this case, the possibility of losing a portion of their pay, well, that was a pretty strong incentive to improve their accuracy.
For sure. And this example also shows that response cost doesn't have to be an individual thing. It can work in group settings as well.
Exactly. So we've explored some real-world examples of both timeout and response cost, and I think it's clear that these techniques can be really effective when used appropriately.
Yeah, but I think it's important to reiterate that, these are not quick fixes. They're not magic solutions that will solve every problem overnight.
For sure. We need to approach each situation carefully, do our due diligence, and remember all those key points we discuss.
Exactly. We need to understand the function of the behavior. Think about the individual's needs and abilities. Make sure we're using these techniques ethically. And always, always remember to incorporate positive reinforcement.
Right. And don't forget about the importance of communication, consistency, and collaboration with everyone involved.
It's all connected. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Deep Dive today. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but I think it's been a really productive conversation.
I agree. And we hope this episode has given you some valuable insights into these powerful techniques. Remember, every individual is unique, every situation is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep striving to be the best behavior analysts you can be. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.